To begin with, the first question that we have selected is from Mr. Jobin Thomas. I will convey his question on his behalf. Jobin Thomas is an audiologist, and his question is, what exactly is democracy? Is it the representation of every ideology or the will of the majority?
So, there's a very interesting discussion that happens across the world on why do you need to use the word republic in the context of a democracy? Why do you have democracy as well as republic? So, I think there are three aspects to this. One, once you say it's a republic, you're trying to repel or dispel the notion that it is a monarchy. It's not. But the combination of a republic and democracy effectively means democracy, which is the will of the majority, can lead to complete silencing of non-majoritarian voices or minority voices. So a republican democracy envisages a situation where the legislative body is not just populated by people in the majority, but it is equally populated by people in the minority, so that there is some kind of a pushback between the majority and minority, and it is not seen as a brutal rule by the majority or a brute rule of the majority. So, even I don't know how many chartered accountants are here, how many lawyers are chartered accountants. Anybody who runs a company or who understands how a company works knows that even in the Companies Act there are specific provisions that permit minority shareholders to approach the company law board or the company law tribunal alleging oppression and mismanagement of the minority by the majority. Which is to say, a democracy, if applied let's say in toto, as is various, will have the effect of depriving any minority voice altogether. A republican democracy means that you make sure that the government is in the hands of the majority with a check and balance in the form of a minority which will stand in the opposition or sit in the opposition. So that is the meaning of a republican democracy. And the body in which this entire pushback plays itself out is the legislative body of the parliament. So hence, both typically are meant to go together. So it is possible for you to be democratic and still not be republican, and therefore be majoritarian, anti-minority altogether. And I don't use the word minority in a religious sense, because the parliament does not use, or rather the constitution does not use the word minority in a religious sense. If you take a look at Article 29, you can just Google it up, anybody can do it these days. It specifically speaks of cultural minorities, linguistic minorities, or any section of the society. So for all practical purposes, a Sanskrit speaking population could be treated as a minority for the purposes of Article 29. Or a Tulu speaking population in a non-Tulu majoritarian state could be treated as a minority for the purposes of that state. And majority and minority are never to be understood from a country perspective. There are judgments on the point, and the constitution also indicates that to some extent. Those are questions to be addressed from a state to state perspective. Because you could be a national minority and you could be a local majority, Kashmir being a very good example of it. Next.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Mr. Vinit Narayana Shastri M, who is a student. Welcome, Vinit Narayan Shastri. And his question to you is, he says, Namaste, Sai Deepak ji. How do you see the next 30 years of this country, given the fact that demographic change is happening rapidly and there is also the illegal immigrants problem? Government is not doing anything about that.
I think what the government is or is not doing is a legitimate question to ask, and I won't run away from it. But before that, just consider this. Hindus are in trouble when they're in a minority. They're equally in trouble when they're in a majority. So which government can save you if you don't have the guts to save yourself? That problem is further complicated by the fact that your trouble is not a political incentive for any government, enough for them to act on it. The next 30 years, I think we are in 2025. I previously said that another quarter of a century could be problematic. In my recent engagements, I have advanced the timelines to say we are looking at a 10 or 15-year problem, not a 25, 30-year problem anymore. And which means if you see repeated instances of demographic imbalance and you see someone constantly testing the waters to see what will the reaction be from the state, let's test the waters, that means someone already knows that they have the numbers plus the state does not have the will, nor the society has the will. I'm happy about rising awareness at least since 2014, or awareness which led to 2014 and thereafter. But it is translating at this point to an elitist awareness which does not have the will or the guts to do what it takes to get the job done, because it doesn't want to dirty its hands. And which means what will happen is you will continue to see lit fests flourishing. You'll continue to see more and more platforms discussing this. But will all of this translate to actual action is the question. If it remains a storm in a teacup, where people gather at a town hall or at a theater or a mega auditorium where they discuss all of this, then they are only reinforcing what they already know. What is the change that comes out of it? You may not know everything that I said today, but you broadly agree with what I've said. Broadly, if not in specific. So what is the change in the movement of the needle that I've achieved today? We are talking to each other and we already agree on quite a few things. How has this managed to bring about a change? Have we converted more people to our point of view? We are not sure of it. 2, will this lead to pressure on the government to act by way of resolutions to say that this audience believes that these are the following actionable points which you must implement in the interest of civilizational security? So one of the things that I've tried to convey in terms of a limited suggestion to multiple platforms is, it's good to organize events, but you must also have actionable goals where the voice of your audience is communicated to the government along with their positions. Lit fests must have clear plans as to what are the issues that we want the government to address. The other side does this brilliantly. They do it brilliantly. Every lit fest, every platform, every organization will have a certain set of intellectuals whose names and credentials are used to write letters, to write representations, to castigate people, to criticize stuff. We have not learned that yet. 2, here's my limited prediction or assessment of how this is going to play out. Because of a young demographic which is hungry for technology and growth, all things being equal and we don't get sucked into the race to the bottom called the reservation battle, our economic future is decent. Unless we go back to the freebie model, we go back to the hyper-reservation model and we kill everything that is possible. You can't speak of startups and competing with China in the same breath as reservations. I don't see how that works. Or at least unfettered reservations. Have some limits, respect the constitutional mandate of 50%, make sure that only the deserving community gets it, do away with the creamy layer. If you don't do that, this conversation is basically a conversation about India's doom. There is no way India will ever be a decent power to begin with. We are not even a middling power today. We are nowhere close to being a superpower. We are not even a developed economy. We are an aspiring developing economy which has been in this mode for the last 50, 60 years. Or maybe the last 20 years. Be realistic about where you stand. Because if you delude yourself that I've already reached a certain position, you will never reach there. Tell yourself that there's a long way to go. While this happens, even after the last 11 years since 2014, I have not seen a clear change in the DNA and the attitude of the Indian state in ruthlessly coming down on mischievous elements in the society. It still handles them with kid gloves. And it has no stomach for confrontation. It has a soft underbelly, which is constantly being punched. And it has happened over the last, I think, at least since 2019, we've been seeing the streets in constant action and a constant fire mode. So change the definition of terrorism from bomb blasts to urban warfare or street warfare, because that is what it has changed into. Because you don't know how to hit a mob, or you don't know how to deal with a mob, plus if it happens to have infants and women, that's it, God save us. Now we don't know which God that will be. So I don't see this as a particularly great period unless we change our approach and attitude. And we also develop the guts and the ability to articulate our position to detractors within and audiences outside. Have a very clear strategy of articulating your positions. Unfortunately, the last 11 years has been an example or a testament to a decent vision with average execution and terrible communication. That is not a recipe for a Vishwaguru at all under any circumstances. Address each of these aspects. We are not short on talent for this. There is a talent pool for this. And the problem is, if you choose to pass this problem as the problem to the next generation, with every successive generation, the pace of the problem and the magnitude of the problem is only increasing. And that is the problem that Indian democracy has been facing, that every generation believes that the next generation will handle, by which time the demographic imbalance only increases to your detriment. And previously it was some parts of the country, now it's all parts of the country. And we will still, again, coming back to this issue, we will constantly blame someone who was a prime minister from 47 to 63, as opposed to focusing on what is happening now. There's a time when you must draw attention to yourself and what you have done. There's a point when constantly pointing fingers to the past doesn't help. So the most boring, obvious, bone-sickening question that we get asked these days in literary fests is, how do we change history textbooks? And then a host of opinions will start. The Marxists did this, the Marxists did that, Nehru did this, Nehru did that, his grandfather did this. You go on saying this for 10 minutes. It made sense to say this in 2014. Perhaps it made sense to say this in 2019. It certainly makes no sense to say this in 2024. They did what they did. What have you done? It doesn't help to constantly draw attention to them, because then it seems like you're the opposition in power and they're the opposition in power, in both ways. Rather, it's almost as if you don't know who is setting the narrative, who's in the treasury bench and who's in the opposition. And at least over the last 5 years, the most serious challenge that's going to emerge for Hindu Dharma, Sanatana Dharma and civilization is not going to be external, it's going to be internal. Because we are going to be bogged down heavily on caste-related issues, in caste-related reservations, and that's going to be a serious problem, very serious problem, which will weaken us and hollow us out, leaving us completely defenseless to the external challenge. And on this, as long as the conversation is sugar-coated, it's politically correct, without truth being the basis, some form of reasonableness being the basis, it is a conversation that will be majoritarian in nature, which means whoever has the ability to create trouble on the streets will ask for reservation, and then we are again 10 steps back. So reservation is no more a question that is based on reality. It is not even based on perceived reality. It is based on distortion of history and gross lies. True instances of serious oppression or discrimination, address them. Do address them. Because if you don't, then that entire population remains vulnerable to conversions, to proselytization. I get all of that. But the way forward is to teach people to survive, as opposed to make them self-reliant, as opposed to making them state-reliant. And somewhere you have to say, is there a cutoff date for this? Is there a point where we can say, okay, after this, some may not necessarily be beneficiaries of this particular, let's say, benefit? If someone asks me, what is the cutoff date for your reclamation of temples or occupied sites? I say, you tell me the cutoff date for reservation, I'll tell you the cutoff date for this. Somehow cutoff date becomes relevant when it comes to reclamation of temples, but there is no cutoff date whatsoever on the question of reservation. At least my cutoff date is in the past. Yours is worst, it's in the future. We seem to have two different standards on the question of jati and on the question of inter-community relations. The logic of a position that applies to intra-community reservation in terms of trying to say that reservation must be there because it needs to address a social wrong in the past, or even perhaps a continuing social wrong in certain places, should equally apply to inter-community relations. The logic doesn't change because the overall issue is the same, addressing injustice, period. Why should the logic change? Next.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Sri Lakshmi, who is a law student. Welcome, Sri Lakshmi. So her question is, in Shabarimala judgment, it was stated that Hindus who worship women as goddess have sanctioned women on the matter of devotion. This observation is completely against all facts. So when Supreme Court makes such irrational observation as an educated Hindu, how I am supposed to react? Will I be subjected to contempt of court proceedings?
No. Criticism of a judgment is completely par for course. There's nothing wrong with it. There are judgments to the effect that you can even criticize a judge, not just the judgment. The Supreme Court has said as much. That not every criticism of a judge is necessarily contempt of court. But if the criticism is meant to prevent him from doing justice or to handle a matter, that is where contempt of court begins. However, if assume for a moment the conduct of a particular member of the bench leaves a lot to be desired, criticism is perfectly justified. There are multiple judgments on the subject. Two, one of the problems of this original Sabarimala judgment of 28th of September 2018 was that sweeping observations were made. Sweeping observations were made that Hindu Dharma does not permit this, does not permit that. Please realize Hindu Dharma is an agglomeration of sampradayas, and every sampradaya has its own sets of rules. So you don't get to judge the practices of the Kamakhya temple based on the practices of the Kanchi Kamakshi temple. You don't get to judge Tirupati on the anvils of Padmanabha Swami temple. Because these are they are different parts. Even in the tradition, they represent different parts of the Devi. They will have their own practices altogether. One may be left-handed, the other may be right-handed. One treats menstruation a certain way, the other treats menstruation a different way. You don't get to comment. Because the very same Hindu diversity that you constantly celebrate for the sake of ornamental argument is represented in the diversity of practices. You can't say Hinduism is a diverse set of traditions and then apply a blanket rule for all temples across the board. So those blanket observations in the judgment reflect an institutional misunderstanding or lack of understanding of the diversity and depth of Hindu Dharma, Sanatana Dharma. That is therefore, according to me, the highest possible level at which we need decolonization, mental decolonization, serious decolonization. That they look at the traditions of this land through the lens of a tourist. Because when you go to a zoo or when you go to a foreign land, you're looking at those people as curious onlookers. They are the subjects of your study. But when you look at your own culture like a tourist, there's a mental problem. It's like looking at your parents through the lens of a neighbor. Makes really no sense. So, according to me, mental decolonization is seriously important, and the best part is finally Several voices on the bench of the Supreme Court have started saying, we need to decolonize our approach to the Constitution. We need to decolonize our approach to the judiciary. We need to decolonize our approach to institutions of this land who are unfortunately litigants before our courts. So there is some hope for change. But the judiciary can never be faulted in isolation because the judiciary is a reflection of the society. It's not as if they have been parachuted from the heavens. They are from the society. And second, at least over the last 40 years, what has happened is, even if there is a diverse set of voices, some batting for the civilization within the Constitution and some speaking against the civilization under the pretext of the Constitution, certain set of voices have been constantly been given prominence. So they are called the narrative, and the others who oppose them are called counter-narrative. Who said you are allopathy and Ayurveda? Why is Ayurveda not the mainstream? Why is allopathy not the counter-narrative? So I think the good part of what has happened in the last 11 years is that voices of dissent have started challenging the status quo. And which is perhaps the reason that by the time the Sabarimala matter went for a reference to a 9-judge bench, read the 9 questions that have been framed for reference to the 9-judge bench. It is a reflection of introspection by the highest court of the land, saying, maybe on matters of religion, we may not know enough. We may not understand enough. So it is not up to a secular constitutional court to distill what is an essential religious practice of a place, because you may not know enough to determine what is essential and what is not essential. Those are the 9 questions which were framed through the review petition, 55 review petitions that were filed against the original Sabarimala judgment, and the reference is awaiting. And those questions clearly show why the original judgment was sent to review. Today, the practice of Sabarimala as it existed prior to the September 2018 judgment has been restored because of this very order. So to answer your question, fortunately that institution seems to be still open to introspection and a change of perception when presented with the right kind of push. The operative word being not right, but push. So what this Sabarimala movement tells me from a larger perspective is, no constitutional battle is a pure legal battle. It is also being fought in the court of public opinion. You want the latest example? Places of Worship Act. These are battles which are also being fought in the court of public opinion. I am not saying public opinion must necessarily influence judicial outcome, because they must stick to the black letter of the law, the position on merits, and do justice to it. But the public should not believe that they have no voice in this entire situation. They do have a voice. On the issue of same-sex marriage, if all LGBTQ groups have a right to speak on the judgment and criticize it left, right, and center, on the question of Sabarimala, why should devotees not have the same rights? Why are certain rights limited to a certain section of people because you think that they're oppressed and not others? So you're not wrong. And let's end it on a positive note, that the institution is introspecting. And I know for a fact, where I happen to appear along with 2 other senior delegates, one is Mr. Satish Parasaran and another Mr. Sridharan, to represent Ahobilam Mutt before the Supreme Court when the Telangana government tried to take it over, and the local high court rejected the takeover. The Supreme Court finally started asking the question, what is the job of a secular state in a religious institution? Who are you to administrate? Why do you take control? So the constant speech or constant discussion on the subject has finally percolated to the highest level possible, where they are also asking this question, how is it that we have allowed all these years where institutions, religious institutions of a particular community are being controlled by an apparently secular state? That question is now surfacing. So sometimes the first battle in court may not result in success, but you must keep taking a shot at that particular issue in that particular institution, because kabhi na kabhi to change hoga. You want a simpler example? The first judgment of the Delhi High Court on the question of section 377 of the IPC was in favor of the LGBTQ community to say that it should be decriminalized. When the matter goes to the Supreme Court, the first Supreme Court verdict was against the High Court judgment. Then when the matter was revisited, the opinion was changed. What happened in between? Advocacy by members of the community, trying to reach out to as many people as possible, presenting their point of view. I'm saying this is what the left does so well. For them, one defeat is not the end of the situation. They constantly attack, they constantly relentlessly pursue the cause, and they make sure that they publish articles, they publish books, they come out with videos. And they make sure that the thinking population has access to only their point of view through mainstream publications, which is what we need to learn. Relentless advocacy. That is the only way this goes forward. Next. Please don't be under compulsion to clap at everything.
Since there are a lot of students, especially law students, we are giving this privilege of having the last question from yet another student. Her name is Madhura K. Do we have Madhura K here? Welcome, Madhura. Her question to you is, sir, what would be your advice to students to build a better India based upon truth, given that we see every democratic machinery is riddled with narratives against the interest of this nation?
The thing about too much exposure to information is also too much exposure to negativity. And especially information that comes through social media platforms. I can confidently say, having been in this battleground for the last 8 years, is despite all the challenges facing us, I am still an optimist. And I've seen perhaps terrible times on campuses when I was a student. I've lived through 98, the no confidence motion in 96. I've seen Kargil, I've seen 9/11, I've seen 26/11. I saw the results of 2004 and its repercussions on campuses. I've seen and I've lived through all of that. And I can say, any day today we are better off. Finally, we have a voice. These kind of platforms on such topics would have been unimaginable maybe even 5 or 10 years ago. This would be almost no-go. This would be considered harakiri for organizers. And today you're able to talk about these topics. You have an audience. So draw a leaf from X-Men. Mutants have finally found a place. And they're able to identify each other through social media platforms. And they're able to collaborate. A lot of my friends, I don't know them, not from Adam, but not from Manu. And I know them only through social media platforms because of a common bond, which is ideological or cultural or civilizational. So I had 2 students walk up to me recently at the Pragjyotishpur Lit Fest in Guwahati that was held just a few days ago. And both of them come from as left an institution as it gets. It's Tata Institute of Social Sciences. And they are from, I think, the Guwahati campus. Both of them know that they don't subscribe to the leftist ideology, but they are stuck in a campus that is virulently left and virulently anti-non-left. And they were looking for people to bond and at least survive in that place. Somebody was wearing the thread and the other realized this was wearing a bindi. They identified each other. And they started talking to each other. And they realized, oh, you're also from the same camp, huh? Okay. We will talk. And that's how they started building a resistance on the campus. When the anti-CA protests were raging in TISS and similar institutions, I know for a fact the number of emails I got from those campuses, from students, telling me, sir, you continue the fight outside, we will continue the fight inside. With consequences for their careers and their futures, they took out pro-CAA protest marches on the campus of TISS Mumbai. So a lot of students are risking it, going out on a limb and defending their positions openly, finally. My reading is actually different. I don't think we have been in the minority. We have just been a non-vocal majority. So it's like this, out of 100 people, 30 people have been shouting. Their narrative has become the mainstream. 30 people know that they want to shout. 30 people don't know which way to go. 10 people don't care. So once from the outside, someone like me or Anand or Vikram or anybody else says, we are here, start the fight. Start the battle. We will protect you legally. We'll give you the arguments, but don't back down. Don't back down. They did it. And that results in the rest of the 30 people thinking, where should we go? Now, out of them, some people might not have an opinion because of lack of knowledge. You give them knowledge and then we'll see what will happen. Some people are opportunists. They'll see which way the wind is blowing. Aaj Congress, us din BJP, now we'll see. So they'll try and balance those positions. What has happened is this 30 now has a vocal 30 to oppose it. And there's a proper split in the remaining 40, meaning thereby that nobody gets to say that campuses will stay left like Indian roads. No. Keep left will be a rule only on Indian roads, not on campuses anymore. That we are very clear about. So my job has been to go to these institutions and say, let's start a small fire here. Narayana, we'll do this and go. And I've done that successfully and very proudly in the most anti-Hindu institutions. Those who have cancelled me have done a great job of contributing to the myth of JSD. And they have in the process demonstrated and betrayed their anti-free speech credentials, making it easier for me to accuse them of being fascists. You let me in, you lose. You don't let me in, you will still lose. Choice is yours.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for addressing all the questions presented to you today in the most insightful and thoughtful manner one could ever do.